How's it going, Bill? It's been a couple weeks since we've talked.
Yep, it's been going great. How about you?
Pretty good. Do you is there some policy against decorating offices that they have, or are you just a interior decorating minimalist?
No, actually, the thing is, my team and I work in this shared space, and this is my sort of secluded office just for phone calls.
Your Fortress of Solitude, which, as I recall, was also minimally decorated. It's basically
Right.
just crystals, right?
So I'm just not here enough to decorate it.
Mm, that makes sense. I have a lot of stuff packed away that I need to decorate my office with. As you can see, I've got a lamp. I love lamp. That's all I have.
Right. You
So,
really love the lamp?
well, I'm just looking at things in the room and saying I love them. That's what I do. But anyways, yeah, other than my schedule being a little crazy, you've been a bit busy yourself and sort of meeting together with some teams and planning some things out. So, we were thinking it'd be an interesting topic to talk about, the sort of like getting teams started, if you will. It's a very broad way of putting it, but uh, I also remember we talked after, we don't have an after dark, as they say nowadays, for our podcast, but we talked after one podcast about, the idea of team management, right? The importance of keeping good people on the team and getting good people. So, we thought it'd be a nice thing to sort of talk through how you put together a team, and then even when you have a team, when you're starting on a new project or phase, how you, I guess, motivate them or set them up to succeed or whatever. Managing a team, Bill. How is it done? Can't we all just eat flat food that people put under a door and not have to work with people?
Yeah. Well, maybe, I mean, managing a team's a huge topic, but maybe just talk about starting a team
Exactly,
uh,
exactly.
or starting a project. So in my experience, projects don't start that often. Like usually, like, if I walk around the halls here at IBM, if I ask somebody what they work on and say, when did it start? They'd probably say, I don't know, because I joined it after it had already started. Um, but I guess now that I think about it, there's like kind of a class of people who are known to be good at working on new things, and they tend to be the ones that get pulled in when a new project starts. So, like one of the things I've talked about before is working on the IBM Jazz stuff, which is our team collaboration platform. So that started in late 2004, and basically a pretty senior engineering guy at IBM, Lee Nachman, and Danny Saba, who's now our CTO overall, basically said we need to do something really new and different in the team, software development team tool space, and we need to build a team from the ground up. And so what they did was basically took their best engineers who actually had experience doing team stuff but not building team stuff, and just said, "Hey guys, go figure it out." So so basically the pattern I see is that new stuff doesn't start that often, but when it does, there's kind of this sort of not an explicit subcommunity, but a community of people who's known to be good at starting things and incubating things, and then
Yeah.
they're the ones who get tapped to start it because it's a completely different skill set to incubate something new versus to create version 5.0 of something that exists.
Yeah, yeah, no, that's a really succinct way of putting something. I hadn't thought of that clearly, right? Like I think, and one of the things that I am often annoyed by the divide of let's call it startup versus corporate coding or enterprise coding, right? Like where you're startup being like we're just trying a bunch of new things and like we're working on something, what you read about everywhere, the kind of hacker news set. Because and it usually falls out of the other end of something you're saying is projects don't start often, which also implies there's a lot of old stuff out there. That is, not that it's old and bad, but it's just like it's already been started and programmers are working on things that exist.
Well,
And
actually, I mean, just to put a finer point on that, if
yeah,
it's old, it means that at least at some point it was good, because otherwise it would have,
exactly.
died or been killed.
Yeah, yeah, exactly, exactly. And so again, old's not pejorative, as it were, in this instance. But I think you're exactly right. And it frustrates developers who are working on the old stuff that a lot of what they deal with is dealing with old stuff, or to put it yet another way, not being able to start something new, right? And the way that you manage, as they say, changing the engines on a flying plane, or as Martin Fowler more appropriately put it, refactoring a long time ago. And so it does. It's one of the not explored enough topics to figure out how you divide those things out. But thinking about from my sort of remove stance, it does seem like you're someone who kind of balances starting things and then running them to an intermediate step and then moving on to starting new things.
Yeah, exactly. And actually, I'll share something funny with you because sometimes I get pings about it. So I try to keep my LinkedIn profile up to date just because I'm kind of OCD like that. And what you'll notice is that it kind of vacillates between the phrase special projects and then some actual thing. So here's the little trick. When it says special projects, it means I'm working on something new that probably I can't write about,
Right.
both because it's kind of strategic or whatever, but also because usually at that point you don't know what it is. So like a year ago, it said special projects, and what it became was our SaaS stuff, Service Engage.
Yeah.
But when we started, it wasn't called Service Engage, and frankly, we didn't know exactly what it should be. And so it's usually not until you're getting close to the announcement that you've got a good sense of what it is that you can give it a name, and then it becomes public, and then you can put it.
Yeah. That's funny. That granted, I made up this title, but that used to be one of my titles at Dell, is working on special projects, because I had that similar problem. Well, problem. I had that similar thing where I was always running around starting up new things, or trying to at least. But sure, no, it's a good. Other than sounding cool, it's a good it's a good placeholder for, like, I'm just working on stuff I can't tell you about.
Or I can't precisely define if I could tell you about it.
Exactly. So then in that you've gone through this sort of bootstrapping a team, if you will, or starting a new project several times. Like what, I mean, what are some of the things in your toolbox for doing that? And just to kind of prime the pump a little bit, like one of the things when we were kind of obliquely talking about this last time is I remember you gave some, and you were going over this narrative about how you were in the hospital and you got a call about working on a new project, which was this great mixed tale of, like, Bill's dedication to work and then also your ability to fend off work, because you were like, that sounds great, I'll talk to you in 2 weeks, bye.
Right.
But it also, also in that story, you're like, oh, I had some people in mind that, like, who I would hire, and that to me seemed like one important thing is, if you're going to be one of these people who's starting things, it's always good, and you tell me if I'm wrong, but to kind of cultivate a list of people you would want to get on the team.
Actually, I have an actual list.
Exactly. So like, how do you, like, just whether it's like day to day or month to month, like, is there always sort of like a little background process running in your head of, like, should I add you to the list when
Yes.
you're dealing with people, or
Yes.
so it's pretty straightforward then?
Yeah, well, I mean, I've got an engineering mind. How else would you do it? Well, I guess to be a little less snide. So when you start a new project, the most important thing is to build a team. Just like, I've never done a startup, but you always hear people say that the most important decision you have to make in a startup is the first 5 or 6 people, because that'll make the thing sink or swim. And that's my experience with starting new projects too. So basically, when I start a new project, if I can't get the right team, then I'll say no, because it's highly likely that we'll fail, or in the worst case, it'll just be painful. So that's sort of a basic negotiation thing. Like, if I can have the right team, then, and the projects, that's the logic. Interesting project, well, interesting / important. Right team, yes. If either of those is false, then no. And in terms of building the right team, basically, I look for a mixture of people who I know and trust, and then domain expertise in whatever the project is.
Yeah. No, and that's I remember when I was, as you like to say, a youngin, like
You said it first. I copied you.
yeah, well, I lose track. I don't maintain those lists in my head as much as I used to, or
Oh,
the
no,
spreadsheet.
it's in a wiki.
There. Well done. Exactly. I remember I used to, read things about, like, staffing, basically, to use the most boring term for it, right? And it was like, it was always emphasizing, like, trust and camaraderie and all that soft stuff, which I didn't really appreciate back then. But nowadays, like, as to your prioritization, it is sort of like, when I think about the people I would want to work with, it's basically, you know, I usually assume most people that I like that they can do the job. Like my first filter is like, I mean, I'll put it a pretty, can I imagine wanting to work with these people? Like,
Right.
would things gel well? And then I worry about if they actually have the skills to do it. Whereas I think it's easy to do it the other way around. Find people who have skills and then see if they're a match. But yeah, especially when you're starting something out, like I don't know. I feel like there's so much confusion and ill-definedness to it that you're going to need people that you like working with. And it even is kind of a secondary concern if they're the type of people who can deal with uncertainty. Because I think most people are pretty good at dealing with that if you kind of coach them through it if they're not trained. But yeah, and I don't know if that's in contrast to maybe you have something to say about this, but if that's in contrast to old projects, so to speak, like I think you still want to work with people that you like. But in theory, at least on old projects, what needs to be done is a little better defined in any given period of time, right? Like fix this bug, update this thing, build this feature. You're not necessarily constantly exploring new options and ways of doing things.
I've
But
actually never worked on an old project. No, honest to
yeah,
God, in my career, I never have.
yeah. I think I worked on one major old project when I was at BMC. Although even then it was a little weird because we were basically, to use the word again, refactoring an old project. Like, well, it wasn't really refactoring, we were rewriting the project. So it seemed like a
Sure,
new
but
project.
that is, I mean, that's how jazz was. I mean, basically, ClearCase and ClearQuest were there,
Yeah.
and we couldn't just say, "Hey, everybody, stop buying that thing that makes $1 billion, and plan on buying this thing that doesn't exist yet." So you have to manage the transition.
Yeah. And to phrase it more carefully, it's interesting to rewrite a product, right? Of course, because it becomes a new project, but especially as you were saying, when you're in a commercial context, things are a lot different if you have an existing large customer base and you're going to swap the product out from under them, right? Like it has interesting challenges. But anyways, back to the team building. So, you have the list of people, and then excuse me, like are there ways that how do you like recruit them to the project? Like, is that generally an easy thing, or like you're like, hey, I've got an interesting idea, and do you find that you have to convince people a lot, or like how do you go about through the recruiting phase of it?
Yeah, it's sort of painful, but not in the way you would think. So usually, if you're working on something that's very important or very strategic, you're going to get who you want. So basically,
Sure.
it, so the first thing is they have to be interested. But usually, if it's well, sorry. So the people that I would recruit are interested in the same sorts of projects I'm interested in. So that's usually a pretty easy conversation. It's
Right.
like, hey, guess what we're going to work on? And they're like, I'm in. The painful part is the extraction process. Because usually, if they're good, no, sorry. So
Yeah.
if
Yeah.
they're on the list, they're good. And that means they're probably working on something that's also important, but less important than the next thing. And so the painful part is the extraction process. Because, unfortunately, people have local rationality. So, like, if I'm the manager of the guy who's about to get recruited, I don't want him to go because he's the guy or woman who helps me be successful. And so there's always this kind of painful, um, discussion and communication. And I guess it's less so these days. In the past, it would be kind of a transition period. These days, the projects are interesting enough that they can just get yanked. But that sort of extraction process is always kind of painful because you
Yeah.
don't want to, like, you definitely don't want to. Well, I mean, you don't want to be a jerk about it, right? That's one thing. But you also don't want to burn the bridge because there's a good opportunity you're going to run into that manager again, and you don't want to have animosity between you. So it's this kind of delicate extraction process.
Right. And then again, I mean, that highlights another interesting difference from what you read about mostly is like this is an independent like startup little companies poaching from each other. You all work for the same company. So, like you said, the likelihood of wanting, to put it in a positive way, wanting to work with that team again, that manager is high, higher than zero, and so there's no reason to piss them off. like you need to find some way of it being more or less amicable because you never know what'll happen if you're all under the same metaphoric roof. Which on the other hand, it's also interesting thinking of like when I've worked in large companies transitioning from jobs, for the individual, you're right. It is kind of easier because you're not necessarily changing like salary or compensation or anything like that. You're just moving to do different work, which is a much less stressful way of thinking about changing your job than actually changing your job.
Actually, it's better than that. Usually it's a good opportunity because usually the new project is more interesting, and because it's new, it's usually in a growth area and therefore a good growth opportunity for them.
Yeah, yeah, no, exactly. Like whereas if you were like thinking of switching between companies or going to work for startups or things like that, like your pay might be affected. You know, it's going like the job security isn't necessarily as bad as it might be when you're hopping around. So it is, it's sounds a lot more comforting,
Yeah, I mean,
if
I
you
guess
will.
what you're saying is there's, significant reward and almost zero risk other than the bridge burning aspect.
Exactly, exactly. And then you're right. I mean that I think again reflecting on my experience, that is the most difficult thing. I mean, I remember one of the more recent transitions within a company I made. I mean, I think it took like 4 or 5 months of just like annoying negotiating to make sure everything was happy and make sure
Right.
everyone was happy. But at the end, that ended up being a very important thing to have done instead of just hopping off to something. Which you can imagine someone like me who can barely like pay attention to one topic for more than 5 seconds, like, is extremely annoying to like have to have an opportunity way out in the future and not be able to do it right now.
Actually, it's interesting you should mention that. That's one of the challenges. So the characteristics of a person who you'd want in a new project oftentimes become problematic as the thing matures somewhat towards an initial release. Because in the early days, actually, we talked about this in one of our first episodes, finishing stuff is hard. So in the early days, you're trying new technologies, you're kind of greenfield, lots of exploration and design, lots of early implementation. But as you move closer to something that you want a user to use and depend on, then you have to do all the kind of mundane but necessary stuff to make it, high quality. The all the non-functional stuff, availability, performance. Although we tend to do upfront that stuff, accessibility, etc. And the kind of person who gets really kind of wide-eyed about the new project will sometimes struggle in that finish phase.
No, I agree. I mean, it's like I mean, not to reflect too much on my work, but like every now and then I have a work like a week like this week that I've had where I've actually done a lot of things, but I haven't sort of maintained the old project. You know what I mean? Like I spend a lot of time starting up new things and like exploring new stuff rather than just sort of maintaining the existing stuff that I have. And it is like, I mean, clearly I'm if not completely, at least in a major way, one of those people who finds it hard to finish things, I guess. See, finish isn't even the right word. Who finds it hard to like feed the fish every day. You know what I mean? Like it's fine to set up a fish aquarium and like get all the fish and arrange the little like pirate treasure that opens up and all that stuff. And then like every day you have to feed the fish and every week you need to clean the tank and like you got to do all this stuff and just maintaining things is difficult for me because I want to go buy another. I want to set up a frog tank and not maintain that fish tank. But it takes a lot of annoying discipline to do all of that. At least from my perspective, annoying discipline to do all of that. Cleaning the fish tank type of work. But I've come across people who love that. It's just and they get. It's interesting. They get really antsy when you ask them to start things up, right? Like
Yeah.
they, in contrast to like my not wanting to like clean the fish tank to beat that metaphor to a dead horse, so to speak. Like the way I always make fun of this stance, and it's totally unfair, is like, you know, you keep wanting me to tell you exactly what to do. Like, and the job is to figure out what to do and go do it. Like, I'm not just going to give you a list of things to do and for you to do it, but in fact, that's exactly what I don't want.
Yeah, no, I think we're talking about different things. So it seems like you're sort of talking about sort of the day-to-day tasks that kind of are boring and create a sense of NY. I'm talking about actually shipping something. So the nature of the work as you get closer to shipping something changes. Like you're not creating new features, you're fixing bugs and you're doing performance tuning and stuff like that. So it's not just, we have a scrum every day. We have a scrum on the first day of the project and the last day of the project. So the day-to-day stuff doesn't change. It's just the nature of the work changes towards stuff that's just frankly less exciting but necessary. There's this quote by, you were a philosophy major, right?
As I recall.
So I love one of my favorite quotes is by Spinoza, which is, "All things excellent are as difficult as they are rare." And I think it's really, really true. So when I work on something, I want to do something that's great and is excellent, and that's really, really hard. And I think that's why you see so many crappy products out there, because it's hard just to have a good idea. But if you have a good idea, it's hard to sort of realize that in a prototype form. But then to actually get it to a shippable form is even harder. So
Yeah.
it's just really hard to do something that's great.
No, exactly. And to summarize, the sort of screed I was going on, it's just like follow through, right? Like you're exactly right to characterize the stuff as like, well, now we need to do performance tuning. Now we need to fix the bugs. Like we can't just explore and add new features
Yeah,
and,
or
and
it
new
could,
things. We need to make it all work.
yeah, or it could even be what's even more painful is sort of design stuff. So it's like we had this mental model of how some feature was going to work, like the user experience of a feature, but guess what? People are not using it correctly. So we've got to revisit this design that we kind of fell in love with and thought it was right. So another thing is Microsoft has this terrible phrase, or I won't try to remember that terrible phrase, but it's basically you have to be willing to trash stuff that at some point you loved. And that's
Right,
really
right,
hard too.
right. The old writing way of putting that is kill your darlings, like your
That's
little
what I was going to say, but I didn't want to say
exactly.
because I think it's terrible.
Yeah. No, it's yeah, it's a funny phrase. Yeah, and so reading through our notes here, I'm reminded of like another framing that we had. It is like the benefits of a long-term team, right? Like versus like the Hollywood model of assembling people. And I think that's the other pivot that we're like I keep dancing around here is like a lot of the a lot of the stuff you encounter normally is all about assembling a team. They do something and then leave, if
Right.
you will. And but long-lived products tend to have a team that sticks together longer, if you will, or at least I don't know. This is one of those like mysteries of Apple, if you will, of how they retain like the teams that do all of these things, and everyone else always wants to learn from it, essentially. But it seems like that becomes like a challenge that you see of staffing is once you started the team and had it running, how do you keep people there? And and then like even answering that, like it seems like part of the answer might be, well, you kind of don't. You let people like Bill roam around and start new things. And so it's almost like jumping way ahead. Part of like starting up a new project is also thinking how you establish it to be self-sustaining, so you can sort of leave eventually, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, the Apple example is really interesting, and I can compare it, but it's actually got some similarities too. So, like when I talk about assembling a new team around a product, it's a new team in the sense that perhaps that particular configuration for that particular configure or deliverable is new, but there's a good chance that 80% of the people have worked on a project before together. So the way I
Mm.
think about it more, and actually Johnny Ive uses this phrase, there's like this kind of core creative community that serves as the nucleus for most new things. And they've got it rendered explicitly via their design group. But even at a company like IBM, there's this nucleus of people that doesn't really change over time, who tend to be involved with new things. So like yeah, I mean, like I can just, as I think about this, I can think of some people who, even though we don't work on the exact same team, we've been driving things together for at least 10 years.
Yeah, yeah.
So like a good example is um, Dan Berg. He's a guy who works in the Rational group, and he's currently working on the sort of DevOps services in support of our cloud computing initiatives. And he and I have worked together for 6 or 7 years. And even though we're not working on exactly the same thing, we'll frequently find ourselves in the same meeting where we make a decision that has impact for 5 years. And so I guess even if you're not on the exact same teams all the time, there's this kind of invisible creative community that sort of together make some of the important decisions that have long-term ramifications, sometimes positive, sometimes negative.
Yeah, no, that's actually an interesting point. Like in the sense of even though you may not be working on the same projects, you kind of are the same team. right? Like a federated team, if you will, or as you were saying, group of people who've worked with each other many times, and then that kind of it's a way of getting the best of both worlds in the sense of the Hollywood model of a bunch of people who assemble on a project and then leave, right? So that
Right,
you can get functional expertise, if you will, but
right.
then also long-term benefits of these people know trust each other and know how to work with each other, and we also kind of like because we have this stable of people, so to speak, of skills, we don't have to spend a lot of time acquiring them, like which is also risky and annoying, right? Like we have all this talent, they work on different projects, and they also trust each other, and they don't always have to be working on the same projects together. And so like especially in the construct of a large company, like is that do you guys explicitly like maintain that community thing, or does it just sort of happen ad hoc?
It's happened ad hoc, but I've actually been thinking about ways to kind of render it more explicit and intentional lately. Like, I mean, I was thinking about creating a mailing list. Because what I
Yeah.
find is I always end up, like when I've got a new idea, like that microservices article from Martin Fowler, like I read that and I was like, this is awesome. And I sent an email to like 20 people, and people like Dan, people like Danny Saba, and it's always the same 20 people, plus or minus five. And so I
Yeah.
was thinking, why don't I just create a mailing list, call it the Fun Bunch, and whenever I want to send one of these things, I'll just send it there, and over time, other people can join it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, it's interesting that like the HR department hasn't like nailed this whatever this thing is we're talking about more of sort of like uh, discovering talent pools within its own walls, right? And somehow like because
It's not for lack of trying.
yeah. No. I agree. One would think that that would be one of HR's core things, but they never quite seem to get it right. At least as far as I've come across, and it is that's an interesting like simplistic way of putting it. It's like, well, we will just search everyone's email box, which probably that doesn't work right from the get-go, and find the clusters of people they talk with, and then like essentially that's the org chart, right? Like and then one of the jobs of HR is to make sure that social graph, if you will, is well maintained in the real world, not just like the actual XML dump of it or whatever, but like how are these people getting along? What do they need to be good and improve and stick together? But it is I don't know, but it's obviously a lot of that just falls on the heads of the individuals to maintain and keep up with, like you cutting and pasting an email list.
Right. I honestly don't even know how necessary the HR aspects are, because they definitely do have like talent lists, but I don't know. I mean, they're sort of different from what the actual communities are, like
Yeah.
the top talent communities. I mean, the analogy I think of is I can't remember who was telling me this. Somebody told me that I think it was at Stanford that, or I'm not going to try to cite the actual example. I'll just kind of render the example in my own words. So, like, there was this college campus, and there were these paved paths where people were supposed to walk, and then there were these kind of natural paths through the grass where the grass was kind of turned into dust because that's where everybody actually walked. And at some point they said, let's get rid of the things that we did and just pave the places where people actually walk. So kind of organically discover the paths or the communities rather than trying to, from a top-down perspective, define what they are or should be.
Yeah, no, I that's a good analogy. So you brought up the microservices thing, and there's an interesting segue in that piece that, as with it's tragically I don't remember the co-author of the piece, but Martin Fowler, as you had a wonderful description of one of his core rhetorical competencies, which is contextualizing and explaining like an emergent phenomena, right? Like saying all the history that came before it and how it fits in and what it solves. Like he's really good at context and documenting things.
Yeah,
As a side note, but he, so it is this piece that we'll put in the show notes where he does exactly that with his co-author with microservices, and it's a good explanation with lots of like, well, this part's not quite figured out yet. We'll see how it goes, and also connecting to web services and things. But excuse me, back to the HR team thing. like one of the things that he didn't discuss too much, but there was this interesting aside of like, and then another benefit, we'll get into defining microservices a little bit, but one of the benefits of microservices is that you orient this cluster of APIs, if you will, or services around a business function, and then that defines the team who works on it. Like it was interesting to see like an architectural like API discussion immediately go to team structure and staffing and actual people behind it, which for old folks like ourselves is sort of obvious. You're like, well, of course that's what goes on, but it's not that it's not those things aren't always so directly connected with each other that you have that you work with Conway's law instead of against it.
Or you try to like use Conway's law to your advantage rather than having it hurt you with your architecture.
Exactly, exactly. So, do you want to take a whack at defining the microservices thing based on that piece, or should I ramble through it?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, he used what, 5,000 words to describe it. You know, probably written over the course of 3 months.
Exactly. I think, again, to use historic analogies, I'll give a very brief explanation than try to go over it in more detail. But it was essentially like, you remember way back when in object-oriented talk where you had objects sending messages to each other? It's kind of like that, except not really, except it's more coarse-grained, so there's bigger messages you're sending to each other, and it's all over HTTP, pretty much. Like he stopped short of basically saying like it's a bunch of RESTful APIs because he wants to do because he wants to allow for binary like buses sending things to each other, which is fine. But it's sort of like the idea you should start with is a whole bunch of RESTful APIs and different programming languages talking with each other to do what we used to call a mashup application. And then let's clean up that bizarre explanation, right? And then you can have like better message buses and things. And so there's another way of approaching it, which interestingly I came across the other day. Like it's funny, like I read that piece, and then several days later I talked with a large enterprise software vendor who had converted their stuff from non-micro, I guess from macroservices, I don't know what the opposite would be, to microservices. And they summarized it well in a use case. Essentially, they said, well, it used to be that an enterprise service bus, all the intelligence was in the pipes, and the clients were dumb. So the pipes would figure out where to route it, how to transform the data, what to do with it in our enterprise service bus. And that would just take a really long time to get set up and change.
Mm-hmm.
So now we switched over to a microservice, and the pipes are dumb, and the clients are smart. So we still
Right.
use like a bus, but the bus just moves bits back and forth, and the clients are in charge of figuring everything out, if you will. And it was a nice roundabout way of putting it. But again, like it's kind of hard without examples to point to define something like microservices, or without 5,000 words. But it's essentially like using a bunch of like RESTful oriented and philosophically aligned APIs, and then whatever clients you want on the back end to exchange a bunch of data and eventually like have some application that does something. It's like what you
Yeah.
would expect a web application to be,
Yeah, I mean,
a modern
now that
contemporary web application.
right now that I think about it, the way I sent the note to the group was the title was something like good article on microservices, and then the first sentence was kind of like the kind of upfront caveating that I assume many of you, we've all been talking about this. I assume many of you already know this. Blah blah blah. Then after that, it was short version, SOA done right. Long version. Long version, link to Fowler's article.
Exactly. No, and that's part of what for myself, what was delightful about his articles. He does spend a lot of time relating it to WS star stuff and service-oriented architectures and things in the past, so you can kind of see how it is SOA done right. and,
Yeah.
and it's interesting because a lot of the problems that are on the horizon that he kind of mentions come up, like having service discovery or agreeing on the formatting of data that's exchanged, like all that stuff that I think old SOA kind of got in the ditch on, if you will, in defining.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think, yeah, it's one of those things where, like, the problem that what goes under the label of SOA, at least how it's known in the enterprise space, was a great problem to solve, and even a great first approximation of the solution. But then the approach that was taken to realize the solution was not good. The opposite of good, bad.
Yeah.
So it was sort of like, let's top down, imagine a set of specs that could be implemented to make these architectures real, as opposed to, let's
Right.
create useful services with simple APIs that somebody could get their heads around, and then let kind of people write simple apps that work across those services and just kind of go from there. I'm doing a terrible job of explaining microservices, but
Yeah. Yeah.
basically that's why I say SOA done right, because SOA was trying to solve the right problem in a good way, but then it just, like you said, it went into a ditch.
Yeah, no, and I think, I mean, to be a bit of a backhanded apologist for SOA and specifically for web services, like capital web services, right? Like, I think, I think the major delta, if you will, or difference between WS Star and microservices, as we talk about them nowadays, is is basically speed. It is basically release cycle speed. Like, I think whether this is how it started, what ended up happening, the goal of web services was that different entities could communicate and interoperate with each other, right? Basically, that we're all doing the same spec and we model out our stuff the same so that it's easier and possible for different things to talk to each other. So, for example, this is probably a terrible example, but you could take supply chain, right? It used to be, and still is in supply chain, there's like EDI, and it's just like crazy wild west of things. There's not a lot of standardization of like all the convenience stores have a different way of saying they want to order another bottle of Coke or whatever. And I'm making a straw man example here. I have no idea if any of this is true. Whereas web services would come around and be like, we're all going to agree on modeling a bottle of Coke the same. Not only modeling a bottle of Coke the same, but modeling the need to order more Coke in the same way. So we all have the same XML payload, and then we're all going to have the same way of talking to each other, and then it's all going to be great. Because we won't have to every time that we come along and have a new supplier we deal with, we're not going to have to recode it to fit to their data standards and to their process. And then once we have that established, then we can do anything, right? Like we can
Right.
basically make composite applications and mix them together. But for whatever reason, one of the things that I think pretty early dropped out of the WS Star goals was speed. Like, you notice in my explanation there, I never said how long this would take.
Right.
Right? Like, it was only important that we could talk with each other. Whereas and this is an important, like, the geezers giving advice to the youngins on the microservices. Like, an important thing microservices has started out with is they're very focused on speed, right? Like, and Martin Fowler mentions this, like, one of the reasons people do this is because they want fast release time or whatever. They want to get stuff into production faster. They want to ship. And, hopefully in this go round of SOA, they don't lose track of that, because I think as Fowler goes through and his co-author go through pretty well, like a lot of I don't know if they go through it pretty well, but when I read it, a lot of the actual implementation of microservices comes down to, and our main goal is speed, right? So a lot of what we do is going to be based on making sure it's fast, not necessarily perfect, if you will, which I think is an important distinction to have.
So the co-author's name is James Lewis. It's not. I decided we shouldn't say the other guy when I could just Google it. So
And he
James
looks like
Lewis.
such a friendly guy. He's got one of those pictures like I was out camping with a significant other and
Right.
messing around in a stream, and she just took this casual photo of me that I use for my headshot nowadays.
Yeah. Yeah. Whereas Fowler's picture is like, I just wrote an article on microservices and now I'm going to get the mail.
Yeah, you're not sure. You're not sure if his headshot was done while he was like mowing the lawn or like touring some obscure Italian city.
Right.
He's got the Western tourist hat on there, which is always delightful.
Right.
But yeah, no, I think something like microservices seems encouraging because SOA seemed like a good idea, and I'll always seem to be depending on it. It seemed like between this hollowed future of microservices and web services, all I really had as an architectural guideline was make really simple APIs and document them well. like that was kind of the only hope for there being like good interoperability between different services, if you will.
Yeah. I mean, I don't even think it's a matter of people remembering to keep it simple. I mean, the dynamics I'm seeing in the industry, this is going to be a gross generalization, but my current mental model is that people who can't do microservices architectures right are going to go out of business. I think it's that important. And
Yeah.
so, I mean, the way I sort of see it happening is that if you've got a set of capabilities, you basically implement a set of microservices to basically expose the APIs, and then you create a set of apps, mobile or web or whatever, on top of those, but it's not one-to-one. Like an app may span 3 microservices. Like for instance, like when we created, so say we were to do Rational Team Concert again today, one of the key services of Rational Team Concerts was build breaks. So with build breaks, I got to figure out why it broke, then I got to code a fix, then I got to run a new build, then I got to close the defect. So it basically involves change management, build, and source control. Um, so if I were doing that today, actually I was talking to an old Rational Team Concert friend about this week. We'd have a microservice each for change management, for build, and for source control, and then we'd create an app that kind of rides on top of those, like
Right.
a task specific app. Because I think the mistake that we and others have made in the past is we sort of say we want to create something that's useful. Useful things tend to span capabilities, and therefore we have to create a big thing. So like Photoshop's a great example, or Rational Team Concert's a great example. You create suites. Office is a great example. But then the mistake is that you create a UI for the suite, and you don't create first-class API. So it basically means that only the monolithic thing will ever be able to make use of those capabilities. So I think it's really important that if you adopt a microservice architecture where you basically have a set of APIs, then you can enable an ecosystem of apps that ride on top of those different sets of APIs. Like
Yeah, yeah.
it's like you said, mashup. It's basically mashups.
Yeah, and I forget. Does he cover that in that article, or am I
I don't
remembering
think
something
so.
else I
No,
read
I
where
don't
it's
think
sort
so.
of where it's sort of like the where it's essentially like decomposing instead of having a monolithic application architecture, you decompose it into a bunch of parts.
Right.
And there's almost in my mind there's almost an implicit like assumption that's driving that, which is and again, it gets down to speed. Like as a business, what I'm going to want is a toolbox of functionality that I will compose into different things as I figure out how to make money. Right? So like I might have a monolithic UI and I think this is the approach that customers will want, and then we release that and they kind of sort of want it. And then there's this one part that I would really like to change, and that's going to take 6 months, right? Like I can't just build to pull an unfair example. I mean, I always think it's unfair to pull from like Amazon and Apple and Google, but it's interesting reflecting on because I think they're one of the origins of the microservices idea, without saying as such, where they have APIs wrapped under everything by mandate of Jeff Bezos or
Yeah, I think
Bezos or
they're the
whatever.
canonical example.
Yeah, but it's interesting to think of their mobile apps. And remember they have like the one Uber mobile app now that basically does everything. But at one point they had a mobile app that all it did was like price check, like it would just scan things for you, right? And they might have even had other apps, but it's
No,
interesting to think.
they still have several apps, and so does
Yeah.
Facebook.
Yeah, and I see this, I can't think of it off the top of my head, but I see this pattern emerging in other app areas where they'll have their core app that doesn't really change often, and then they'll have like experimental apps on the side that will
Yeah,
like do interesting things. Like Evernote does this a lot. Like Evernote had this app called Hello that was business card scanning. And it
right.
was almost like a way to incubate a set of functionality around business card scanning. And now, for the most part, the main Evernote app does all of that stuff. And so,
Right.
the point being that I would assume that there is microservice or microservices like functionality architected into those clustered into Amazon, Evernote, and things, such that as a product owner or the business person, I could say, well, I don't want to change the main product, but let's experiment over here with this little business card thing. And let's refine it and work it. And if that works out, we'll put it back almost into mainline. As a business person, maybe I don't think that way, but we'll put it back into the main project. And it's a way that we can innovate and move fast and come up with things, which is it's for me the reason I go over this at length is I always thought mashups was kind of a weird, silly idea because there's definitely situational apps that are interesting, but what's the long-term play with mashup stuff? And I think that's where composite applications, to use another word, come into play. Is it allows a product owner or the business to experiment with new things in order to develop the main project, if you will, which
Yeah,
seems
I
like
have a,
functionality that hasn't existed before.
I have a slightly different take on it. I don't disagree with anything you said, but my take on it is that the kind of lifespans of parts of a system are very different. So when you talk about logic and data and sort of core business logic, those tend to move at a pretty slow pace. Like,
Yeah.
the life cycle of a bug fundamentally hasn't changed. It's new, it's triaged, it's closed, it's high severity, it's low severity. That stuff doesn't change. But UIs and apps are always undergoing experimentation, sometimes because
Yeah.
the design language changes. Design language, there's an aspect of fashion that comes along, and also you may just want to recast it. So look at the huge ecosystems of Twitter clients that have a very different take on the Twitter experience. Like there's Twitter clients now that are geared towards celebrities who want to kind of engage in a meaningful way with their communities who are massive. And it's not the same as you and me just kind of looking for our, 10 to 20 replies every day. So it's the same data though, like, right? Like Lady Gaga fundamentally has the same data structures as you and I. It's just that her app needs, her task needs are very different than you and I. So it makes sense that she'd have a app that was geared towards her use cases. But I mean, is Twitter going to fundamentally change their data model to enable Lady Gaga? I mean, they may have to enable some stuff, but mostly it's going to be in the UI layer and the kind of the basic workflow layer.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think that's a good place to leave off. And I think we have our title for the episode, Bill, which is Lady Gaga fundamentally has the same data structures as you and I.
Yeah, that's a good one. I don't know if Lady Gaga and data structures have ever been in the same sentence before, so we're innovating.
Exactly. That's how it happens. You just hash it out. That's good stuff. Well, all right. Well, I'll. Do you have anything you want to point out for our users? Anything interesting happening in the future?
Well, I guess we should do our normal kind of, Twitter thing. So you're at Cote and I'm at
Yeah,
Bill Higgins, and
exactly.
our usual groveling for feedback.
Yeah, and I'll as an odd note, like have you checked out the Twitter analytics thing they have?
No,
It's dangerous, Bill. You should look at it, but
dangerous
try
in
not
what
to let
sense?
it rule your life because it's like for all this talk that the industry always has about being data driven decision making, there can be too much of that. Like it's actually like it shows you how many people have read it, clicked on it, favored it, like all this stuff, and therefore you start sort of gaming it. Like I've always heard that if you add pictures to tweets, people engage with it a lot more, and it's true. So you
Okay.
might notice over the past couple of weeks, I have a lot of pictures in my tweets, right? It's almost like the lesson I have learned, and I hate it. It's one of those, to as the famous podcaster of our podcast renaissance, Merlin Mann, will say, like, 12 mortgage refi breast enhancements you may not have heard of or whatever. Like it's that kind of tactical stuff, but it is like it's really worth your time to put a related picture in link posts that you have. It'll really help, like a lot. So anyways, you should check it out, the Twitter analytics. That's my little recommendation. I was also going to say we had to do a bit of an ad, but why not? So my work 451 Research has a cloud conference in October, and I got my hands on a discount code, so you can get $200 off the registration, which I'll put in the show notes. I think it's like MC200 when you go register for it. But I'll put a link to that with the code, and if you're interested in the conference, and I'll be giving a panel that's basically developer marketing and relations, a couple of talks around that topic, and there'll be lots of cloud stuff to check out. You should come to it, you the
Okay.
audience. It's fun, and if you want to come to it, I can probably arrange that as well. That would
Okay.
actually be. We'll see how that pans out. But yeah, just check the show notes for a link to it. I've been to this conference once when I first started, and it's a fun mix of like cloud, software, and service provider people. It's like right at the nexus of everything that's changing nowadays. So with that, why don't we
Have a
wrap?
great week.
As always, we have show notes at underdevelopment.io, and we'll see everyone next time.